Hi, everyone. Really good to be here again. Before I start, because I always start these things a little nervous, I need a little help from you. Part of what we're going to talk about during the day is, Pauline uses the term emotion, yes. I think of emotion journalistically as using our full humanity. Human beings are made of senses, and we have our 5 physical senses, and then we have our 6th sense. Some people call it ESP, some people call it perception. It's essentially emotional intelligence. We're also going to talk a lot about working together, being better working together, because the truth is human beings are relational. We're not wired to be alone, and we get better when we're together. So, to help me with that, I want to ask you all a little interactive favor, because after all, it's the digital age. Can you all take out your cell phones? I assume you have them. Okay, everybody have their cell phone? You think this is where I'm going to ask you to turn your cell phone off? Not true. What I would like you to do is take your cell phone and turn to the person next to you and take a picture of them. Can you please do that? Okay, everybody got a picture? Now I want you to do a really challenging thing. I want you to hand your cell phone to the person next to you and ask them to take a picture of you. All right, I've created a monster here. You can get your cell phones back now. What you've just done is had a connection. You've worked with someone. Some of you did it a little better than others. Some of you sort of, went outside the bounds, but that's fine. You just made a connection. You worked with someone. You also have now in your phones a picture of someone who can help you, no matter who they are, because we can all help each other. So instead of going through life taking selfies, I like to encourage people to go through life taking you-fies. You take a picture of me, and I take a picture of you, and then we've done something together. Okay? Thank you for that. I got to figure out where my clicker is here. I had all kinds of things prepared to talk to you about today, and then when I got together with Pauline on Monday night to kind of talk through the conference, I opened the conference brochure, and the first thing I saw were these words from Alex Tizon. And they kind of took me aback. I think how many of you were here when Alex spoke 3 years ago? Okay. Alex has been here. He's part of now your community. And I don't know how many of you know, but he died 2 months ago. And I was one of the people who did his eulogy. And the words that you see here from Alex are part of an interesting story, because they exist because I asked Alex for a favor, and he agreed to it. I was at a conference. I was supposed to do a keynote. Typical of me, I was behind, I was on deadline, I had no idea what I really wanted to say, I had no focus. So I reached out to 5 or 6 of my friends in the world of journalism with a simple question: why do we need stories? One of those people was Alex. I had been Alex's editor for quite a while, and Alex had a tendency to disappear for days or weeks on end. He really didn't like working with people. And I often can get a hold of Alex. He would literally even shut off his phone, which is tough if you're an editor and you've got a reporter working for you. And yet, when I sent that question out, I didn't really expect to hear from him. I got an answer back right away. And this was part of the answer he gave. So these words exist. They have now been around the world multiple times. They're printed again and again and again. And they exist because I asked for a favor. I needed help, and Alex gave it to me. Sure. Why do we need stories? This is from Alex Tizon. Stories give shape to experience and allow us to go through life unblind. Without them, the stuff that happens would float around in some glob and none of it would mean anything. Once you have a version of what happened, all the other good stuff about being human can come into play. You can laugh, feel awe, commit a compassionate act, get pissed, and want to change things. The other thing that I find interesting is that on the back of your program, and up there, you have some words of mine. And they are part of the same speech that I gave, the keynote that I gave that day that was inspired by these comments from my friends. So there are these things that exist now in the legacy of storytelling that exist because I reached out to some people and said, I need help, and I asked for favors. And as a result, my thinking was expanded. My sense of creativity was opened up. I didn't feel alone. That's what I want to talk to you about today. Here's my friend Alex. We're in Bucharest together a few years ago. God, I miss him. This is the cover of the Atlantic magazine's June issue, next month's issue. It came out 3 or 4 days ago, which is also ironic. And it's Alex's last story. On the day they found out he was dead, the Atlantic, without knowing he was dead, called to tell him that they had chosen his story to be the cover of the June issue, which is a major, major thing in his career. When they made the call, they learned he had died the night before. They worked with his family to get photos and stuff for this story. It is about a woman that Alex always spoke to us about named Lola. Sometimes we refer to Lola as his aunt, sometimes as his grandmother. When I pressed him on that one time, I was like, who is this person? He said, well, in Filipino culture, Alex was a Filipino-American, he said, we have these extended families, and there's often somebody in the family who becomes the caretaker. Alex's parents were both career people, and Lola was the one who raised him and his siblings, cooked for them, cleaned for them. Alex always spoke about Lola as the most important person in his life and the best person in his life. This story reveals that Lola was his family's slave, that she had been given to Alex's mother when Alex's mother was a little girl, and for the rest of her life, she was enslaved by Alex's parents. Once Alex's parents died, he took her in, and he told her he would take her home, send her home to the Philippines. He gave her money. By this time, she was so embedded in this life of servitude that she couldn't make those decisions anymore. I offer you this story as an example of someone who gives us a lot to learn from. We learn from each other's stories. We learn from each other. If you study this story, and I highly recommend it, you learn a lot of things about the best kind of narrative writing. We're talking about narrative today. We'll talk about craft, but you guys know the craft pretty well. I think the best thing to do is continue to study the craft, pay attention to it. If you look at Alex's story, it teaches us a few things. It teaches us how to use very simple language. Alex is a very spare writer. And a lesson here is that the more dramatic the story, the simpler the writing should be. There's maybe one line in Alex's long piece that has any kind of flourish in it. The rest is very, very, very spare writing. He writes in a really interesting structure. He writes in what we would call a broken or a braided narrative, which means he bends time. He goes back and forth in time, and yet you never forget where you are. And he does that by moving you through scenes, getting to a point where then you need to know something about the past, and he takes you there, and then he brings you back to the moment. The journey is, the story is a journey, and journeys are absolutely essential to narrative. Narratives have to take us somewhere. They don't have to be big epic journeys. They can be small journeys. They can be a 2-minute journey of the heart. But they have to go somewhere. And this is a story in which Alex takes a journey, first, on the first level, to deliver Lola's ashes back to her home village in the Philippines. And on a second level, to go back and discover his own feelings about the fact that she was his family's slave. It's also a quest. There's a term actually at NPR that they call, a certain kind of story they call a reporter's quest. And all good narratives are quests. They're built around a question that we are driven to answer. In this case, the quest is Alex trying to come to terms with his family's reality. There are several other quests in here, but this is a classic quest. So when you're thinking about narrative and you're looking at stories that you want to do that way, think about the elements that make up a narrative and figure out if your story fits that. But you need a journey, you need a quest. You need simple language, and the reporting needs to drive the writing, always. Great writing is 95% great reporting. There's another thing that happened with this story, unfortunately, is that it has caused an incredible and very ugly dust-up on social media. So this story was published, distributed over Facebook, Twitter, and a lot of places. And the next day, the Seattle Times, which is the paper where I worked with Alex, wrote a story that basically accused Alex of being a liar, of not being truthful. Because 7 years earlier, when Lola died, Alex wrote her core obituary and then was interviewed by the paper for her obituary and never said she was a slave. He never revealed that part of her life. So the reporter who did that story, that obit for the Seattle Times, felt betrayed and wrote a piece calling Alex out. I offer that because one of the things we also have to accept when we do this kind of work is that it's risky. It involves great risk. If we do straightforward facts journalism, we can indeed take some protective comfort in hiding behind our notebooks, in quoting people and saying, well, I got the quote right, that's what they said, so my story is true. In sort of wrapping ourselves in a veil of what I think of as false objectivity. He said, she said, I'm detached, I don't influence anything. If you get into stories that really are about the way we live, you have to take risks because you can't stay behind that veil. Now, I'm not talking about advocacy. I'm talking about humanity. And Alex's story, unfortunately, is now wrapped up in the mess that is humanity. Judgment, projection, this sense of betrayal, a sense of defensiveness. And if we do this work, we have to be prepared for that, which means we have to know how to do this work as well as possible so we protect against that with the craft. You don't want to take this kind of work lightly, even if the story is lighthearted, because people's lives are what we're dealing with. I told you Alex was something of a lone wolf. At one point when I told him that he had to start coming to the newsroom and actually showing up for work, he got a cubicle and he got some really big tall plants and he built a wall of plants around his cubicle so nobody could see him. I'd go to find him and he would have disappeared because he also picked the cubicle that was closest to the back exit. And he would just sort of slip out when no one was listening. He liked to sit in his basement, he was a woodworker, and work with wood. He did not like to talk about his stories. And when I'd sit down and I'd try to talk to him, he'd get very, very nervous. But the other truth was, Alex was better because he had help. He was better because he teamed. This is a photo taken by Alan Berner, photographer at the Seattle Times, one of the best photographers in the US, I think, who often partnered with Alex. Alex didn't even like to go on the road with photographers. He kind of preferred his own pace, but we'd often say, no, you got to take a photographer. Alan, go with them and keep him out of trouble. This happened right after 9/11. We put Alex and Alan in a rented car and told them to drive from Seattle to New York and tell the story of America along the way. It was a very vague idea. And they were going to pick their own route. They were going to sort of let serendipity and instinct guide them from place to place. The one place I insisted they go was Oklahoma City, which was the site of the bombing of the federal government building 5 or 10 years earlier. Largest domestic terrorist attack in the United States up until that point. Alex did not want to go to Oklahoma City. He said, "That's a cliche, Jacqui." And I said, "I'm sorry, the readers are going to expect Oklahoma City. Go to Oklahoma City, and then I don't care what you do." So Alex went to Oklahoma City, but he was kind of pouting. So he got there, and he just went to the hotel room. He said, "Well, I have to write." Alan, a photographer, can't sit in the hotel room, right? Man, if you want to learn how to report, hang out with photographers. They got to be on the scene. So Alan's running around, kind of looking for stuff, and he spots this. And he stops and he talks to this young woman, and then he calls Alex and he said, "You get your ass here right now." Here's the quick story. This is the memorial. This is a year later. They went on a second trip a year later. And this is the memorial that was built to the dead victims of the federal building. There were like 127 people killed that day, maybe 135. And it's a park setting, and these are chairs. They light up, but they're really, they're like gravestones. And this woman, young woman, was walking through here, and it looks like she's at her wedding, right? It looks like a wedding picture. What's she doing in a cemetery? Well, the really interesting thing is she's 15 years old, and she's celebrating her quinceañera, which is the coming out party for Hispanics. Young Latina women, when they're 15, are introduced to the world as young women. And they get all dressed up, and there's this big party celebrating their coming of age. And when her mother asked her what she wanted to do for her quinceañera, she said, "I want to be with my father." Her father was a civil servant working in the federal building. His job was to help immigrants who were trying to get legal papers, who were coming to the United States to get work papers, and he would help them fill out the paperwork. This young woman was in 3rd grade. Her name is Bonnie Martinez, in 3rd grade and in school when the bombs hit the federal building. The teachers had them sit under the desk until they went home. No one told them what was going on, and so she didn't know until she got home that afternoon that her father had been killed. This was 8 years later, and maybe it was 5 years later, and she's now with her father on her quinceañera, because that's who she wanted to celebrate him. And I want to read you just this little passage from Alex's story about this. He wrote a bigger story about Oklahoma City, but he had one little passage. And pay attention again, because his language is so simple, but he packs so much emotion into it because of the simplicity. And here's how it goes. On the afternoon we were there, meaning in Oklahoma City, Bonnie Martinez, dressed in a formal white gown and tiara, came to honor her father on her quinceañera, a Latino ceremony marking a young woman's 15th birthday. Her father, the Reverend Gilbert Martinez, was on the 1st floor, helping a friend fill out Social Security forms when the bomb found its mark. It was supposed to be a quick errand. Bonnie was in the 3rd grade at the time. Her teacher mistook the explosion for an earthquake and told her students to crouch under their desks. It would be hours later, after school, when Bonnie arrived home to weeping relatives, that she found out. "I miss everything about him," she says plainly. She had learned to summarize 6 years of grieving into a single idea. Alex would not have written that without Alan Berner, because Alan Berner found the story and handed it to Alex, who then wrote it. The story also wouldn't have the power without this image. So working together, we end up opening doors to things we wouldn't find on our own. I mentioned that Alex was a bit of a lone wolf, and there is a mythology, kind of a proud thing that happens in American journalism that we do our work alone, and we used to fight for our bylines, we'd compete, people wouldn't want to share story ideas, very competitive culture. And over the years, we're learning that that's not necessarily the best way to do journalism. And I have found throughout my entire career, that is by far not the best way to do journalism. So when I was thinking about you all today and thinking about emotion and collaboration and teamwork and all these things that make us better, that amplify them, I found myself thinking of one of my favorite parables. I read a lot of children's books. Children's books teach you a lot about narrative. And there's this old story I remembered from my childhood called Stonesoup. And I called Pauline and I said, hey, do people in the Netherlands know Stonesoup? And she was, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I was a little mystified because when I looked up the history of Stonesoup, it comes from Europe. It's an old European folktale. What's really interesting about the story of Stonesoup is that a whole lot of countries claim it. France says Stonesoup came from an author there. Portugal claims it. Germany claims it. Denmark claims it. China claims it. There is literally a story in China that's the Stonesoup story. It's just called something different. I'm going to read you briefly a version of the story of Stonesoup. Some versions have their central characters as soldiers who are weary and exhausted and heartsick after war and are trying to make their way home. Some have them as a young woman whose husband has died and she's living in a poor place and she's been abandoned by her family and she has to make her way on her own. This version focuses on a kindly old stranger walking through the land when he came upon a village. As he entered, the villagers moved towards their homes, locking all the doors and windows. The stranger smiled and asked, "Why are you all so frightened? I am a simple traveler looking for a soft place to stay for the night and a warm place for a meal." "Oh no," the villagers said, "there's not a bite to eat in the whole province. We are weak and our children are starving. We have nothing to share. Better keep moving on." The old traveler shrugged and smiled and says, "That's all right, I have everything I need. In fact, I was thinking of making some stone soup to share with all of you." He pulled an iron cauldron from his cloak, filled it with water, and began to build a fire under it. Then, with great ceremony, he drew an ordinary-looking stone from a silken bag and dropped it into the water. By now, hearing the rumor of food, most of the villagers had come out of their homes or watched from their windows. As the stranger, the old traveler, sat in front of his cauldron and sniffed the broth he was cooking, licked his lips in anticipation, hunger began to overcome fear throughout the village. "Ah," the stranger said to himself loudly, "I do like a tasty stone soup. Of course, stone soup with cabbage? So much better." Soon a villager approached, holding a small cabbage he had retrieved from its hiding place and added it to the pot. "Wonderful," said the stranger. "You know, I once had stone soup with cabbage and a bit of salt beef as well, and it was fit for a king." Soon the village butcher managed to find some salt beef, and so it went. Villager brought potatoes, another onions, another carrots, mushrooms, and so on until there was a large, delicious, nutritious meal for everyone in the village to share. The village elder offered the stranger, as he was leaving, a great deal of money for that magic stone, but he refused to sell it and traveled on next day. It's a story of stone soup. I think of stone soup as a metaphor for what happens when we do work together. When we say, by giving away what we know, by sharing our knowledge, by offering up the answer yes to a request, we all get fed, we all get nurtured. I want to tell you a few of my own stone soup stories from my career to emphasize this point. It's been interesting thinking about this the last few weeks because the more I did, the longer my list grew, until I realized pretty much everybody in my career, whether they've been in my newsroom or out in the field, has given me something that I've held on to for the rest of my career, and that's made my journalism what it is and made my journalism better. I mentioned the story Crossing America that Alex Tizon did with Alan Berner. It wasn't their idea, and it wasn't my idea. On 9/11, we got a call in the newsroom in the Seattle Times from one of the political reporters at the State House down the road. And he said, "Why don't we cross America and find out what's going on?" Political reporter. So I got the call and they said, hey, Ralph's got this interesting idea, what do you think? And I said, I think it's a great idea, but only for the right reporter, and that's not Ralph. Ralph wasn't that kind of journalist. So I said to the other editors, if we can get Tizon to go, I think we're in. Then I had to call Ralph and said, Ralph, that's a killer idea. I can't thank you enough. I'm going to send Alex Tizon. And Ralph said, that's brilliant. None of this would have happened without Ralph Schwartz down at the State House. When I did AIDS in the Heartland in the 80s, which is my Pulitzer piece, many of you know of that story, the story never would have started without the photographer who basically dared me to meet these two men who were dying of AIDS. She had met them 3 or 4 months before I had. She had taken several pictures. One of them had almost died. I kept saying, there's no story for me if he dies. I can't follow somebody as they die if he's already dead. Kind of crass, but that was the reality. And then one day she came to my desk and she threw a whole batch of photos down at me. 2 to 3 months of photos of these men, and she said, you tell me there's no story here. And I looked at her and I said, go get the car. And we went and met the men. We spent the next year following them. However, so there's one big gift. As I was getting ready to try to figure out how to write this story, and I was very lost and confused because it was huge and I didn't know what to do, and I had tons and tons and tons of notebooks. I had all of this material. I was having coffee with one of my best friends from the newsroom. Not an editor, just a fellow reporter. And I was probably blabbing about how crazed and lost I was, and she said, well, why don't you tell it in real time? I said, what are you talking about? She said, why don't you tell it as a serial narrative in real time? Nobody cares. It's hard to get people to care about people once they're dead, if they've never heard of them. But why don't you make us, if you want to do a diagnosis to death narrative, walk with them while they're dying? It's exactly what we did. We wrote 4 chapters. The guys were alive. Both of them were alive for the first 3. And then we followed Bert, who was the surviving partner for the last one. Writing it in real time made people have to decide if they could take that journey with these guys. They couldn't just dismiss it as something that had happened then. That was a gift from Catherine Lanfer, and it taught me to think about the possibilities of stories differently. One of the biggest gifts I ever received was from an editor of mine when I was at the Pioneer Press. I had always wanted to be very successful on a traditional track. I covered government, I covered politics, I did what the boys did, frankly. And I had this lifelong goal and ambition of someday covering the Supreme Court. It was a very traditional ladder, and it was guaranteed success in journalism. I had finally been offered in St. Paul the job of covering the State House, state government. I would have been the first woman in the history of the Pioneer Press to cover state government. About a week or 2 before the legislature, the government starts up in session, I get a call from my editor. She asked me to come into her office, and she mentions that there is a group of local people, relief workers, who are going to Africa to cover the big famine in the mid-'80s, the sub-Saharan famine, which was the big first televised famine. And she said, so 8 or 9 people in the newsroom have asked if they could go, and I've decided I want to go, but you're going, if you want to. And I kind of looked at her and I said, gulp. And she says, well, you need to understand 2 things. If you go, everybody else in the newsroom will be mad at you. And 2, if you go, you can't cover the state legislature. And you have until tomorrow to decide. I came back and I told her I wanted to go to Africa. And just before I left, she called me into her office again. She closed the door and she said, how scared are you? And I burst into tears. And she says, yeah, I know, but here's the deal. I'm sending you because I want you to write the story you'll write. So just do what you do when you get there. Trust your instincts. Don't try to do what you think other journalists would do. So she let me kind of calm down. And then as I was leaving her office, and now we're in the newsroom where everybody can hear, she decides she needs to have a show of force because she liked those sorts of things. She yells across the newsroom, Banaszynski, 2 more things. Don't get killed and don't fuck it up. And then she said, by the way, have fun. Everything in my career changed after that. I learned things reporting in Africa about why I valued stories. I learned about the kind of stories I wanted to do. I had always been torn between stories of humanity and stories of government and politics, and I finally learned where I wanted to plant my flag. It doesn't mean I wasn't doing that other stuff, but it was in service to the stories of humanity. There was another person not in the newsroom who gave me a great gift when I was covering Africa. I came back after a month in the field. Again, I didn't know what to write. It's kind of a history with me. And I was pushing deadline, and I just couldn't get my head around the story. I have a friend from childhood. We've been best friends since we were 12. And we used to write to each other 2-3 times a week. And she hadn't heard from me for a month while I was out of the country. And then she didn't hear from me for 2 to 3 weeks when I got back, because I was obsessed with this story. So finally I got home one night and there was a message on my phone machine from her. Her name's Becky, and she was really angry at me. She basically said, I know you think you're some big deal international journalist, but I'm not chump change, call me. So I was like, okay, message taken. And she's not a journalist. So I sat down that night, I still couldn't figure out what to write, and I just thought, well, at least I'll write Becky a letter. I'll get that off my list, clear the decks, and then maybe I can write. I started to write, and I wrote for 7 hours. And the only reason I stopped was because the tech guys came and shut the computer down for like the upgrades they do overnight. So I went home about 5 in the morning, took a shower, came back, and thought, I still don't know what to write. So I was printing Becky's letter out at the newsroom printer, and as I was reading it, I realized I had written the story that I wanted to tell. And what I learned from that I've never forgotten, is that our journalism needs to be one-to-one. We send our stories out to hundreds and thousands of people, tens of thousands, however many, but the truth is, the person who reads the story is an individual. And for them, they want a relationship with us directly. So knowing that I was communicating with somebody I cared about made a difference. Big message, care about your readers. Knowing that I was communicating with someone who I really wanted to understand what I had gone through in here, as well as out here, made a difference. And knowing that I could relax and just tell my story and not worry about all the other noise around me made a difference. I've never written the same since. Becky doesn't belong in a newsroom, but she taught me a lot about doing good journalism. There are plenty of other stories about people who've helped me. Little things like the intern who I would call over when I was struggling on deadline, and he would identify the place in the story he got confused. And what I learned to do was give my stories to other people, watch their eyes, and the minute their eyes go back in a story, you know you've lost them. You can literally watch someone read your story and know where you've messed up because their eyes will start to shift. They'll try to go back and track it. I learned that from an intern. I think he was 20 years old. I've learned hard lessons. My other half, who I think is going to get here this afternoon, is also a journalist. And he's a much better writer than I am. He's a different kind of editor. We've had trouble over the years partnering on things. And several years ago, I brought a story home, and I was very invested in it, but I wasn't sure it was working. And I gave it to him, and I said, I want you to read this. I don't want you to look for misspellings or typos. I just want you to read the substance of the story. Tell me if I'm making a point. So he's reading and reading and reading, and he has a pen in his hand like we always do. And then on page 5, he circles something. And I'm like, what? He said, oh, you misspelled a name. I took the story away from him. I called him several names, and I didn't show him my copy for another 20 years. I was that offended. Then we kind of settled down. We got our game together. 3 or 4 years ago, I'm trying to write a chapter for a textbook on ethics. It was actually literally about how there really is no conflict between your humanity and your journalism. They need to merge. But because it was a textbook, I had like academia in my head, and I was all kind of screwed up. And I had written a bunch, and Don kept saying, Don's my partner, he says, why are you struggling with this so much, Jacqui? It's just some stupid textbook. Nobody's ever going to read it. It's like, well, thank you for that. And so finally I said, look, I really need help. I need to know if I'm making a point. Please don't look for typos. Remember what happened 20 years ago. Let's not go back there. Actually, yeah, long memory. And so I just want you to tell me if I'm getting where I'm making a point. So he picks it up, and he reads it. He reads 1 page, he reads 2 pages, he reads 3 pages. He throws my entire story back on the table, looks at me and says, blah, blah, blah. Best editing I ever got, blah, 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 make your point. You can learn from anyone if you pay attention. I could go on and on and on with the stories that have been my Stonesoup stories. Everybody who has been part of my journalism, whether they've been in the newsroom or outside of the newsroom, has done something to make me better, deeper, sometimes save my life. I literally had a guy tackle me once because I was in Antarctica and an airplane was being pushed by the wind and I was in front of it and I didn't know, and he literally tackled me and saved my life because this airplane would have run me over. He didn't have to do that, but he did. So, what does this all mean? Yes, we help each other, but the bottom line is then we still have to do the work. We can't just say, well, now I've got a teammate and everything's groovy. We have to do the work. I had to write the 24,000 words of AIDS in the Heartland, despite Catherine's help. I had to write the 16,000 words of Africa, despite what I learned from Becky and the chance that Deborah gave me. I had to rewrite the entire book chapter after Don said blah, blah, blah. The work happens alone at our keyboards at a certain point. We get lost in our notebooks. We're unsure of our way. It's lonely. It's really hard. Writing is really hard. We got to focus, we've got to think, we've got to try to communicate, we've got to make decisions, we've got to problem solve, we've got to do all this stuff. So how do we do that? We could talk about that for the rest of our lives. I have 5 C's, as in the letter C, that I think of as sort of the box that I think all good journalism lives in, if you follow these 5 C's. The first one is craft, the work itself, caring about our craft and trying to get good at it. Alex Tizon was telling me one time that he spent 15 years miserable as a journalist because he was trying to copy what other journalists did. I did the same thing at some point. There are people who actually teach this now. It's called modeling, where they say, go get something you love, maybe Ernest Hemingway, maybe Roald Dahl, and then just type it, copy it. We struggle with that notion because we want our own unique voice, but you know what? People who learn how to paint go to museums and paint the great masters to learn their technique. Study technique. Read like a writer. Pay attention to what it is a writer is doing to engage you, to lose you, to make you turn the page. Study movies. Study music. Study children's books. Look for those elements that make stories work. Second, curiosity. When people ask me what the most important traits are, now that I teach, parents say, what are the most important traits for a journalist? They want to know if their child is in the right field. And I say 2 things, curiosity and critical thinking. I think curiosity is critical thinking. I have this idea that people go through the world and there's these things around, right? And some people notice those things and move on. Some people don't notice them at all. They're just in a fog. Some people notice them and think about it and then forget. A lot of people notice things and have an opinion about it. And then there's the journalist who notices things and asks a question. So live your life as like a question. Wonder about everything. Why would you not want to be curious about the world? Because it's a kind of a curious place. So curiosity is number 2. Number 3, creativity. You need to accept the fact that there really are not many new stories. And in the world of narrative, there's archetypes that we go to over and over and over again. But the truth is, every story is new once you write it, because no one will write it the way you will. So don't worry if you're onto a new story. Figure out what you're going to bring to that story. Find a new place to stand, a new place to see a story, a new person to tell it through. Be creative about finding your way around problems, by finding a way to pitch a story and get it published. Hell, you got to be creative these days about finding ways to make a living. But find a new way, learn from other forms, learn how to tell stories in tweets. I do narratives, nano narratives on Facebook when I travel. And it teaches me an interesting thing about how to get through a true narrative, beginning, middle, and end with a message in about 8 or 9 lines. So don't just go out and do the same old thing. Some of our journalism demands it, but that's boring. And if you're bored with the story, the reader's going to be bored with the story. Hold some of those stories and bring some creativity to them. Take some risks. Who cares if one story fails? A lot of stories fail. As long as you're not libeling anybody, as long as you're accurate, go for it. I once had somebody try to write a weather story as a tone poem. Managing editor thought I was crazy, but man, the readers loved it. They just loved it. 4, courage. We all know the kind of courage it takes to report from a war zone, the kind of courage it takes to stand up to corruption and power. But I also want to encourage you to have the courage to be bold enough to ask the hard question, the sensitive question, the painful question, the personal question, the human question. Years ago, I was at a conference, a narrative conference in Boston, and there was a dust-up between investigative reporters and narrative writers. The investigative reporters referred to what they did as hard journalism and what we did as soft journalism. And I got a little bit, I got angry. And I had kind of a smackdown with one of the investigative reporters, and I asked him how much more courage it took and how much harder it was to sit with somebody who's dying and watch them do that and ask them about their death, and didn't that take as much or more courage, wasn't that harder than getting some records and data about a corrupt official and putting it in the paper? He's not talked to me since, but that's okay. When I did AIDS in the Heartland, I had to sit down with these 2 men and ask their permission to watch them die. And I had to tell them what that was going to mean, the complete loss of their privacy. I had to ask them who brought the virus into their relationship. So who was killing whom? It was an essential question because their relationship was about commitment and their very relationship was killing them. Don't people just wonder about those things, where you put that in your own life? I covered the Olympics twice, and I once had to ask a 16-year-old American girl who slipped on the balance beam what it was like to be the one who lost a medal for America in gymnastics for the first time in decades. Not an easy question, but it was the one to ask, because she was going to have to live with that the rest of her life. So have the courage to go where the story needs to go. And finally, compassion. We don't talk about compassion much in journalism. Again, as Pauline said, we have that sense that that's emotion and we're getting involved. No, you can't be afraid to care about your stories. You can't hide behind that wall of detachment to do stories about true humanity. Again, I'm not talking about advocacy, I'm not talking about first person, I'm talking about wading into the middle of reality, bearing witness, and bringing it back out again so other people can try to make some sense of it. I need to care not so much about ultimately what the public decides, but I need to care that they know enough to make a decision. I need to care that I'm helping them understand. I need to care that I'm giving them the possibility of experiencing something relevant and new and different so they can realize what the world around them is really like. You've got to care. If you don't care about the people you write about, who else will? So, compassion. And compassion is all built on caring about the other. There's my 5 C's. I want to end quickly with the real ending of the story of Stonesoup. Old traveler comes to town, nobody will give him food, he brings out his pot, and everybody starts contributing until everybody eats, everybody's nourished, everybody is better for the experience. Remember the ending, the village elder offered the stranger a great deal of money for the magic stone, but he refused to sell it and traveled on the next day. And then here's the real ending. As he left, the stranger came upon a group of village children standing near the road. He gave the silken bag containing the stone to the youngest child, whispering to the group, "It was not the stone, but the villagers that performed the magic." We are the villagers, you are the magic. Thank you.